In order to plan for treatment using books, we want to do four things. We want to select books and consider genre. We want to plan learning targets and questions that can inspire discussion during the read aloud and after the read aloud. We want to plan follow-up activities and visual supports that can help give students more opportunities to use the language and content of the book. And we need to plan some methods for data collection. How are we going to monitor the progress of our students? So let's talk about some ways of selecting books. How do we go about selecting books? There's a wonderful article by Schwartz and her colleagues that gives a great deal of evidence for what kinds of features in books cause them to be more difficult or less difficult, more challenging or less challenging. What I always say first is that we should be selecting stories and informational texts that match some kind of classroom theme or unit, so that our work as SLPs is connected with what's going on in the classroom curriculum. That's what students need to be able to talk about. When we look at stories, there are certain language features that we should consider. So we need to think about how complex is the vocabulary in the book, how many words are unfamiliar to students. This requires that we understand their level of language, current level of language. We need to look at the language complexity. What is the syntax in the sentences in the book? How long are the sentences? How complex? What is the story structure? Does it follow a very predictable story sequence, or does it have a different kind of odd story progression? How much inferencing and problem solving is required? This one seems particularly important for our students on the spectrum because they often miss inferences, miss making those inferences, and so they're very literal and they hear the actual story and they don't really take it any further than that and make connections. So inferencing is probably one of the most important things to consider for students on the spectrum. Then how familiar are the activities and experiences of the characters? If the activities and experiences of characters are very similar to the experiences that our students have had, then it's much more likely that the student will find the story easier to handle. And then last, the illustrations. How supportive are they? I've seen books where the illustrations are beautiful and artistic, but they don't actually represent what's in the text very well. And that can be a problem for our students with language disorders and students on the spectrum, because there's a lack of consistency between the text and the illustrations. So we want to pay attention to those things. Schwartz in their article gives a lot of good data and how to have sort of benchmarks for easy or medium or hard stories. Their research was focused on preschoolers, but I think these concepts certainly can be taken into elementary, middle, and high school as we select books for different students. What you'll notice when you look at informational texts and guidelines for selecting them is that many of those same language features come into play. So we want to look at the vocabulary again. We want to look at, especially, does the text include explanations of vocabulary that's likely unfamiliar to the students? Information texts can be hard if those explanations are not provided, so that during the read aloud we're having to come up with those explanations on the fly. We want to look at the language complexity, same as with stories. We want to know how familiar the content is. Will the text be used to teach new content or to support students' current knowledge? And that's important. If the content is going to be brand new and unfamiliar, and we're using the book to teach new content, then we're going to want the vocabulary, the language, to be more simple, less complex, less dense with brand new words. We're going to want, in that case, illustrations that are much more supportive of the content of the book. So think about all of these things as trade-offs. With any information book, we want to look at how supportive the illustrations are, just as we would with stories. Do they include real photographs or drawings? Do graphs or diagrams provide clear explanations? We want to look at print features, just basic features of how the text is organized. And we want to look at whether the text is strictly informational or does it include a storyline as well. Including a storyline can be good because it can help, those are called hybrid texts. It can help students access the informational text more easily. But it also can be hard, I think, for students on the spectrum because it mixes features of these two genres, and they can find that very confusing. So that's something to consider if you're looking at informational texts to select. My suggestion for practicing SLPs is that they choose a topic from the classroom curriculum and create a text set that they can use on that topic. So, for example, they could have in the text set one story, one informational text, and one poem. They could have two stories maybe and compare and contrast the text structures in the stories. They could have two informational texts on the same topic, or two poems, or one story and one digital text. But whatever they do, create a text set and then create learning objectives and activities that they could use for a variety of students on that particular topic. What that allows us to do is streamline. We have a unit that we've developed fully, and we can use it with multiple groups of students over the course of years. So we might pull it out one year for our first and second graders, and then the next year use it again for first and second graders on our caseload. And so it allows us to create materials that we use over and over and over. And after a number of years of creating text sets, we have a lot of material for therapy that allows us to avoid what often happens in speech services is the pulling a game or a card deck off the shelf and using it to address very specific language targets in a way that doesn't generalize easily to everyday contexts. So text sets can help us solve that problem and also be efficient for us. I used to use text sets with lots and lots of kids. I would have one unit that I was using with kindergarten, first and second graders. I'd have another unit I was using with third, fourth, and fifth, depending on where my my groups, how my groups were orchestrated. And so this was really a time saver for me. It helped me do a lot of really good therapy with a lot of different kids across several weeks of time. This is an example of one of the text sets that we put in our book. It was geared for preschool and kindergarten age students, and the topic was the life cycle of frogs. So we had one informational text, a tale of a tadpole. We had another that was a story, a frog thing, and then we had two poems, the Pollywogs and the Wood Frog, and we used those in multiple ways to address a lot of different targets in the classroom with both typically developing kids and kids with special needs. And that brings up another point, that when you create text sets like this, you can certainly do these text sets in pull-out therapy in your own speech room, but it also gives you the possibility of doing therapy in a more integrated way. So working with one of the classroom teachers to integrate this unit into their classroom, and we all work on, we all use the same texts, we all work on the same follow-up activities and experiments and things like that, and that means that we can get into the classroom and serve students in a very different way, and in a way that definitely helps us support generalization of skills. There are tons of resources out there to help us select books. I think the one that I want to highlight most here is Geber's Books Are for Talking To, and that is a book that is written for SLPs specifically. It gives us a lot of different books, different ideas for addressing various skills through those books. It also has a great set of index material in the back, and so if I want to work on initial consonant P, I can look for that list in the index and find a bunch of books where initial P occurs a lot. And so that's a great book for that speech target. It has a whole bunch of speech targets in the index. It has a huge variety of language targets, including syntax, semantics, pragmatics, morphology, phonological awareness, you name it. And so it's a great resource. In our clinic, we've also tried to purchase a lot of the books that are included in there so that when you find something, we have the book on the shelf and can use it in treatment sessions. We also need to think about exposure to the texts that we choose. So we want to provide a lot of opportunities for our students to get repeated exposure to those texts, but we may not really want to spend all of our treatment time doing that. So if I think a student really needs 3 readings of the book before he or she is really capable of engaging in a lot of discussion and follow-up activities around that book, then I might recruit someone else to do those 3 readings prior to speech sessions. So I could get a classroom assistant, a speech-language pathology assistant, or a teacher to read aloud. Maybe I have the teacher read the book to the whole class, and then I get someone to read it a few extra times with the student on my caseload. I've also used books on audio in the classroom or at home. They can be commercially made, or we can record them ourselves. And so students can have access to the audio to go with the book. Often all they need is some exposure first, and then they're familiar with the book, and then we can come in and do our speech-language intervention using that same book, and they have prior knowledge. We can recruit parents at home. I used to use school volunteers. They loved this particular job. Rather than copying things or cutting things out, they got to go to various classrooms and read with my students, and the books were all there for them, and they would read with my students several times before I would see and start that student on a particular unit. We also know that repeated readings are important because they allow us to expand and extend the talk over multiple readings. So the first time we read with a student or a group of students, we might only achieve a certain shallow level of discussion, but a second or third or fourth time reading that same text gives us a lot more opportunities to scaffold talk during the discussion. It also provides children with multiple exposures to the new words, and it can be a great way for us, especially if we did things like sending the book home, having 5 target new vocabulary words on cards, have the parents review the words and the definitions before reading, and then after reading, get the student to tell them what those words mean and what they meant in the book. Those can be great activities for homework. So instead of just copying a worksheet and sticking it in a folder for students, giving them homework that parents can do very easily, but is real and deals with real language, real interaction. Repeated readings also give us the opportunity to help the children take on a more active role in retelling. So the first few times we read it, we may be doing most of the reading, whereas maybe the third or fourth time, we, instead of reading the text, have students in the group doing the telling on that page, and eventually maybe the students retell the entire story using the pictures, or the entire informational text using the pictures, with just some support from us occasionally to help them produce better language. So we sort of transfer the responsibility of the reading or the retelling to students as they're capable of doing that. So in this segment on planning, we've talked a lot about choosing books and how to ensure repeated exposure to those books. Our students need more than one read aloud of a book in order for them to really benefit and learn language. What I see most often in the classroom is they read books one time, and that it's not actually great practice for typically developing kids, but it certainly is detrimental for the students who have language disorders or autism. And so we need to be orchestrating, after we select the books, we need to be orchestrating opportunities for them to have repeated exposure.